So I'm going to tell you a story like that, and it's the story of Marduk, and it's the Mesopotamian story. And Mesopotamia is one of the earliest civilizations, and it emerged as a consequence of the amalgam of Middle Eastern tribes. So over a very long period of time. You could think the gods of all of these tribes were warring in an abstract space, in a conceptual space, and that would be the space of argumentation and conflict. And out of that a meta-story emerged. And this is the meta-story, and it's one of a host of similar meta-stories that came out of the Middle East, one of which is the account in Genesis. Okay, so here's the story. So there are two primary deities to begin with, Abzu and Tiamat. Now in order to understand that, well, here's how the Mesopotamians conceptualized the world. There was a, let's call it a disk. That's salt water. Well, why? Well, what happens when you go to the end of the continent? There's salt water everywhere, right? So wherever you go, you run into salt water. So that's the disk that surrounds everything. Now, why is it a disk? The world is a dome on a disk. Why? Well, say you're standing in the middle of a field. What does the world look like? A dome on a disk. So it's a phenomenological representation. So the bottom of the dome is the ground on which you stand. What happens if you dig? You hit water, fresh water. So the dome of the land is on a disk of fresh water. What happens if you go to the edge of the land? You run into salt water. The dome of the land is on a disk of fresh water on a disk of salt water. Okay, those are the two gods. Tiamat is god of salt water, and Abzu is god of fresh water. And it's happenstance in some sense, because that's the masculine and the feminine, and they could be attributed all sorts of different geographical areas. So for example, see if I can think of a good example. It doesn't matter, I'll just leave that for now. Okay, so the two primary gods are Abzu and Tiamat. Tiamat is female and Abzu is male, and they're locked together in an inseparable embrace. Okay, so how do you understand that? Easy. Yin and yang. It's the same idea. Here's another representation. This is a cool one. I've got a couple of them here that are really cool. This is from China. So this is Fuxi and Nuwa. I think I've got that right. But I just love that representation. It's so insanely cool, this representation. So you see the sort of the primary mother and father of humanity emerging from this underlying snake-like entity with its tails tangled together. I think that's I really do believe this, although it's very complicated to explain why. I really believe that's a representation of DNA. So, and that representation, that entwined double helix, that is everywhere. You can see it in Australian Aboriginal art, and I'm using the Australians as an example because they were isolated in Australia for like 50,000 years. They're the most archaic people that were ever discovered, and they have clear representations of these double helix structures in their art. So, and those are the two giant serpents out of which the world is made, roughly speaking. It's the same thing, you see that in the staff of Asclepius, which is the healing symbol that physicians use, although usually that's only one snake, but sometimes it's two. So that's a Chinese representation, and then there's this. That's the Egyptian representation. We talked about the Egyptian story the other day, right? We talked about Isis and Osiris. So there they are, cobras. Their tails are twined together. See, they emerge out of that. That's the dragon of chaos that manifests itself as culture and nature. That's the representation. That's unbelievably cool. So, okay. So, anyways, back to the Mesopotamian story. So, Abzu and Tiamat are the primordial deities, nature and culture. They're entwined together, and they give rise to their first category of children, and those are I think you could think about them as the elder gods. Now, what do they represent? Well, the question is, what do the gods represent? And they represent sort of like primary modes of being. It's something like that. So think about Ares, or Mars, the god of war. Well, that's that's a representation of single-minded aggression. And then you can think about Eros or Venus, which is a primary representation of sexuality. And you might say, well, why are those deities? Well, that's simple. They live forever, and they control you, and their personalities. So that's that for that. It's like, yes, obviously. You know, and you know that you're under the sway of anger, you're not in control of yourself. If you're under the sway of erotic possession, you make a fool out of yourself. You're a tool of the power that drives the continuation of the species forward. Hunger is the same thing. Any primordial motivational drive we've conceptualized in this class as a personality. But those are transcendent personalities, and they're eternal. They're forever. And so that's why the Greeks, for example, thought that human beings were just the playthings of the gods. And this idea is echoed in the Mesopotamian stories. So then you can think about it sort of neurodevelopmentally as well, is that out of nothing, out of culture and nature, emerges, say, the 2-year-old. The 2-year-old is a battleground of primary motivational forces. And something like that is being hinted at in the Mesopotamian creation story. The first progeny of the fundamental union of chaos and order, Abzu and Tiamat, is the proliferation of these primary motivational forces. They're sort of like the Titans, or the what it was that the Greek gods kept underneath the mountain. That's Zeus. What's the name of that? They're like they're earthquakes and fires and that sort of thing. They're primordial forces. Okay, anyways, so these children are produced, and what happens? They're very noisy. They run around doing all sorts of things. You could think about them as grown-up 2-year-olds causing all sorts of trouble. The first thing they do is kill Abzu and make their home on his corpse. It's brilliant. Now the story doesn't say much about Abzu other than that. The culture deity, the primary culture deity, is not elaborated up that much in the Mesopotamian story, and I think that's probably because at the time of the Mesopotamian, civilization was new enough so that we really hadn't mapped the mythology of culture. The Egyptians did that much more, and I know I told you that story first, but that's just how it goes. So the elder gods make their home on the corpse of Abzu. Well, what does that mean? Well, that's sort of how it is. You inhabit the corpse of culture, right? It's the dead past. But it's not just the dead past. One of the things that's very cool about the Mesopotamian story is that the elder gods are foolish enough to kill it. It's the death of God, by the way. It's no different from what Nietzsche pronounced. This has been going on for a very, very long time, this collapse of belief systems. They kill it carelessly because they don't understand what it is that they need to survive. They kill it carelessly, and then they try to live on the corpse. I think that's what the postmodernists do, by the way, because they assume we have this tremendous system of value that's been built up across time, and it sustains us, and everyone is criticizing it and trying to destroy it. And it's, well, we live in its corpse, and that won't nourish us forever. It has to be replenished, and there's nothing in the postmodernist philosophy that can act to replenish. Anyways, they kill Abzu. What happens when you kill order? Chaos comes back. Tiamat. Now this is Tiamat. Here. Feminine, but also the dragon. So it's you think, out of this fundamental reptilian treasure bearer, culture and nature emerge. And they can pull back into that very rapidly. So here's an example. You've all seen Sleeping Beauty, I presume. How many of you have seen Sleeping Beauty, the Disney film? How many of you haven't? Okay, so there's a couple that haven't. There's a scene in Sleeping Beauty where the evil queen has imprisoned the prince who's going to wake Sleeping Beauty up. So he's the logos, or he's the heroic individual, or he's that element of her consciousness that wakes her up. You can read it either way. She's got him trapped in a dungeon, so she's the kind of ultimate Oedipal mother, you know. She's the mother that has her 40-year-old son in the basement who's like overweight and unhealthy and watching video games and being covered with Cheeto dust, and she always like feeds him sandwiches so he won't leave, you know. And she says, oh, it's a good thing you didn't go out in the world and make some poor woman miserable. So anyway, so that's the evil queen. He's got the hero trapped in the dungeon. So he goes out, he escapes, and then she goes after him to try to bring him back and turns into the dragon. That's what happens in Sleeping Beauty. So that's that reversion of the archetype into its even more primordial force. So anyway, so Tiamat is kind of an amalgam of feminine nature and also this more underlying primordial symbol. So anyway, she is not happy. She is not happy that her children killed her husband. And so she thinks, oh well, enough of these creatures, we're gonna do them in. It's a flood myth. It's the same idea. So what happens in the story of Noah, this happens worldwide, is that human beings get all corrupt and make a lot of racket and break all sorts of rules, and God thinks, oh well, you know, enough of you, we'll just bring in a flood and wipe you all out. That's chaos returning. You destabilize order too badly. There's a flood, and that brings with it all sorts of new things because it's water, but it just drowns you. It drowns you. Now Noah is a good man, so he can ride out the flood. He's the hero that can go down into the chaos and then back up, because he hasn't let go of his morality despite the fact that the entire society has disintegrated. So he saves everything. So it's like Moses crossing the Red Sea and then coming out the other side. Same sort of idea.